Hi, I'm Kevin Hoyt, Platform Evangelist with Adobe. Welcome back to this series on RIA problems you never knew existed. Now in this session, we're going to talk about creation queuing. Now what's creation queuing? Well, to understand the value of creation queuing, we're going to actually take a look at what it takes to load a site into a browser in the first place. If you look at something like a Gmail or an Amazon or other types of fairly kind of expansive common applications that we visit on a day in, day out basis, you might be looking at somewhere in the range of about 880K. Now 880K under an ideal condition will run about 6.5 seconds. Now obviously bandwidth factors in here, but this is a general kind of ballpark based on just some informal testing at my desk, connected to just a regular broadband connection at home. Your mileage may vary, but 880K, 6.5 seconds. Now, for one page, and if it's expressive enough, if it's a real rich experience, then maybe 6.5 seconds is long enough to wait. But what if your application is bigger? What if it's not just one page? What if it's not just one module? What if it's something as expansive as an enterprise CMS system that has hundreds of different screens? Well, in the case of 10 screens, we can say that that would be 8.5 meg and would take 65 seconds to load up that entire application. Clearly, that's entirely too long to wait. Nobody would ever get any work done waiting for that for a whole minute just to get your 10 screens loaded. And 10 screens, really, in the scope of what is possible in an RIA, is still a really small number of screens. If you think about something like an SAP or other types of enterprise systems, you might be looking at hundreds of screens. And where does that leave us? Well, I've got good news, I've got bad news. The bad news is that despite how intelligent you think your caching mechanisms are for maybe loading scripts or loading Swift assets or loading images and relying on that they'll be in the browser's cache or what have you, despite how intelligently you think about that, eventually, as your application scales in complexity, you will hit a point that your users will waste time waiting for that application to load. And you don't want that to happen. Ideally, you shouldn't have to scale before you hit that problem. You should eliminate that problem before you even get off the ground. And that's what creation queuing is about. So that's the bad news. The good news is that we know what it takes to move from screen to screen. And we have certain patterns that have evolved around going from screen to screen. Knowing what those patterns are and applying creation queuing within will really help you accelerate the delivery of your application to your users. So a couple of different examples here. Menus, tabs, accordions. A tab is probably one of my favorites, right? A tab might have 100 tabs, it might have 10 tabs, it might have 2 tabs, but each of those is relatively essentially represented as a screen. So that screen, then you want to go from tab to tab to tab. You clearly don't want to load that all up at once. You want to load them up incrementally. That's kind of the essence of what creation queuing is. So given the tab metaphor and taking it one step further, let's say that we've got a tab here with 5 different steps on it. So the first screen loads, and then we want to do something with the rest of the screens. Now how you handle that is going to depend on how you want to queue things up. So one of the options is to render just the first one when it loads at the application startup, and then render the rest of them, 2, 3, 4, 5, or whichever one that the user goes to based on their interaction. Right? So if I click on tab 3, when I click on that tab, then I make the request for the server to go ahead and bring in that next part of the application. Or maybe I don't even take the time to render it. Maybe I have loaded it, but I won't even take the time to render it until I click on that third tab and drive that user interaction drives that behavior. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to go ahead and render the most common ones up front. So as an example might be render 1, 2, and 3, those tabs that you would put towards the front because they're the most commonly used. Let's go ahead and put those and render those and take the CPU necessary to render those all right up front. Let's load them, let's render them, let's get that going so that more than likely the user is going to get to those points and have that ready for them to work with. Now when they get to 4 and 5, which they may use less, when they click on that tab, then you go ahead and make the request to load that up or take the CPU necessary to render it. So you do that based on user interaction. That's the second way. And then the third way is to only render number 1 at startup, and this is one of my favorites, is that once 1 is started up, don't wait for the user to interact at all. They're going to be using that screen, they're going to be looking at that screen, and they will waste imperceivable valuable seconds, at least to them, moving their hand to their mouse, moving their hands to the keyboard, taking a look at the screen and recognizing what's on it. While they're doing that, your CPU is just sitting there idle. So why not leverage the CPU to go out and load up those screens and render those screens in a queued fashion? So I get screen 1, I see screen 1, I might start interacting with screen 1, and then behind the scenes, now that I'm interacting with the application, the rest of it is loading up in the background. Now obviously you want to be careful about how far you take that, but all three of those are great examples and great uses for what we call creation queuing. Well, that's it for this segment. Join me again for another segment on RIA problems. Until then, I'm Kevin Hoyt.